Sometimes when my brother Micah went from Moresheth to Jerusalem to prophesy for Yahweh, my husband Yaakov and I would go with him too. My name is Jerusha. My big brother Micah, the prophet, had always been my hero. He was an unwavering lover of Yahweh. Remember when Micah spoke to you? He told you there was plenty of excitement going on in the southern kingdom of Judah during the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah during the years 750 to 687 BC. My brother Micah was called to join the prophetic team of one of the most revered prophets, Isaiah. The story of Micah's life would not be complete without sharing with you stories about his mentor and colleague as well. I was in awe of Isaiah. He heard so clearly from the Lord. He was a highly educated man, and he spoke and wrote with eloquent language. He knew more words than anyone else I had ever known. His very presence commanded respect and authority. His name means Yahweh is salvation. In a sense, his name describes the main prophetic message of his writings, too. As a younger prophet, my brother Micah had much to learn from him. Isaiah began to hear from God during the reign of King Uzziah, the father of King Jotham. Zechariah, the priest, was a faithful scribe for Isaiah. Avi, Zechariah's daughter, was the wife of King Ahaz. The first 5 chapters of Isaiah's book, written early in his life, were warnings for Judah and Israel, as well as descriptions of the day of the Lord, and a beautiful poem about God's vineyard. I wish I had time to share it all. We loved to listen to him read from his scrolls. His home was not very far from ours, and when he was not in Jerusalem, occasionally we'd visit him there. In the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah had a vision of the Lord. He was high and lifted up, sitting on a throne in the temple. I still remember him telling us about it with trembling in his voice. There were seraphim or angels around the throne singing, "Holy, holy, holy." Smoke was all around the throne as the angels sang, and there was even an earthquake. One of the angels took a tongue and lifted a hot coal from the altar of God. He took the coal and touched Isaiah's lips. He said, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged." Then the Lord himself said to Isaiah, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Isaiah immediately replied, "Here I am, send me." Can you imagine what it would have been like to be in the actual presence of the Lord? With the authority of the Lord now resting on Isaiah, his prophecies now became more powerful and personal. During the years of King Jotham, Uzziah's son, the Lord was quiet. But when King Ahaz came onto the scene, Isaiah was called to speak out. Remember what Micah told you about King Ahaz being a wicked king? He sacrificed on the high places to idols and even sacrificed his own sons, throwing them into the fire to appease the god Molech. Those were dark days. The temple was so desecrated with false altars and idols that eventually the doors to the temple were closed. Yahweh worshippers were in the minority. Isaiah and Micah and the rest of the faithful remnant were hiding most of the time. True believers were mocked. The priests and Levites that followed the Torah left the temple service. Only the priests that were so-called tolerant of modern thinking and not closed-minded against being inclusive to all types of worship remained. Yet Isaiah was not afraid to confront King Ahaz. He met him at the aqueduct by the fuller's field and gave him a prophetic word from the Lord. Ahaz was fighting fear because he knew that the northern kingdom of Israel had joined forces with the army of Syria to come against Jerusalem with the goal of setting up their own king. They had already attacked cities in Judah and taken away many captives. Well, God, who was even more angry with the northern kingdom at that time, had a word of hope. "It shall not stand, nor shall it come to pass," Isaiah told him. Isaiah also prophesied that both the northern kingdom of Israel and Syria would not be nations for too much longer. Their threat would last for a few years, yet come to nothing, and both of their capitals would eventually be destroyed along with the rest of their kingdoms. Isaiah, who clearly did not care for King Ahaz very much, asked Ahaz if he would like a supernatural sign to confirm the prophecy. Oftentimes, these signs validated Yahweh and also the prophet himself as authentic when the words came true. Whether Ahaz simply didn't want to validate Isaiah or wanted to turn his nose up at God, he foolishly refused, pretending to not want to weary the Lord. In any case, Isaiah went on to give one of the most famous prophecies of Messiah. A virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel. Then he cautioned King Ahaz that though Jerusalem was safe from Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, Judah would be attacked by Assyria, the very kingdom he was paying tribute to and appealing to for help. Their army would someday overflow the entire country like a flood, taking the towns and cities and rise up to Jerusalem, the very neck of the kingdom. As you can imagine, none of this changed King Ahaz's behavior. These were dark days for the servants of Yahweh. I can remember Micah and my husband Yaakov spending time in hiding with Isaiah and the faithful priests and Levites, reading the scrolls of Yahweh and praying for the nation of Judah. God told Isaiah not to fear the officials who were saying that the believing remnant was forming a, quote, conspiracy against the government because we would not go along with their religious reforms. Can you imagine that? Us? All we were doing was speaking the truth. This reminds me of America today. Will you, as believers of Yeshua and Yahweh, be eventually accused of forming a conspiracy against your government because you won't conform to a liberal and permissive yet controlling agenda? Are dark days looming ahead? God gave Isaiah some explicit instructions to give to the faithful remnant. Do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. The Lord of hosts, him you shall hallow. Let him be your fear. He told us through Isaiah that he, Yahweh, would be our sanctuary, but a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. But then he told Isaiah to divide the scrolls of the word of God, seal them, and hide them among the disciples. To those who were willing to be taught of God, the word became increasingly precious as the days grew darker. We were to wait on God and hope in him. Isaiah and his family set their jaw to be used by Yahweh to display his signs and wonders. I can't help but wonder if this prophecy may have been given for your encouragement, too. The great scroll Isaiah wrote for God's holy word was later divided into 66 chapters. In a sense, it was like a mini Bible. The first 35 chapters included prophecies regarding Israel, Judah, surrounding nations, along with the tribulation and millennial kingdom. Here you can see the prophetic concept of telescoping. What does that mean? It means that the prophecies may be fulfilled in some form close to the time they were given, and again in complete fulfillment in the future. Remember Joel? The locust came up against the northern kingdom in Joel's day, and they also foreshadowed the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse of Revelation 6. This happens all throughout Isaiah's book. Many of the prophets, such as my brother Micah and Zephaniah, Jeremiah, quoted Isaiah, even Yeshua, Jesus, and some New Testament writers. The middle section of Isaiah's book is a dynamic historical interlude, chapters 36 to 39, including 3 miracles. The final section contains many uplifting prophecies about coming Messiah, Day of the Lord, and the millennial reign of Christ. Oh, I know, you'll want to hear about those 3 miracles. They were absolutely amazing, perhaps some of the most wondrous in the entire Bible. Don't miss reading Isaiah 36 to 39. When Micah spoke to you, he told you that Ahaz finally died, and we were given the answer to our prayers. King Hezekiah. He loved the prophet Isaiah. He was often seen in King Hezekiah's court, advising and encouraging him. The reforms Hezekiah brought to Judah were swift and astounding. Imagine worshiping in the temple and celebrating Passover again. However, the prophecy Isaiah had given about Assyria coming to attack Judah weighed heavily on Hezekiah's mind. He fortified the city walls, built up an armory of weapons, stored food, and built a tunnel from the Gihon spring outside the city walls, diverting water into the city to have water in the event of a siege. The Assyrians did indeed come. They took all the fortified cities of Judah and turned their attention to Jerusalem. Fear gripped the city. The attack was imminent. The power and brutality of the Assyrians was unprecedented. Those of us from the small villages flocked to safety within the fortified walls. Our faithful remnant remembered the promise, only up to the neck. The commander of the Assyrian army taunted the leaders of Judah outside the city gates. Such an amazing drama. King Hezekiah, tearing his clothes, headed to the temple to pray. In the meantime, he sent word to Isaiah to pray too. Isaiah reassured Hezekiah all would be okay. But then a threatening letter came from King Sennacherib of the Assyrians, and Hezekiah headed straight back to the temple, laying it out before Yahweh and crying out in prayer again. We were praying, all of us, waiting on the Lord. Isaiah finally appeared with a different letter. This time, it was Yahweh's dictated message back to Sennacherib. You can read it. It was what we needed to hear. Isaiah also prophesied that the Assyrians would not take the city. They would leave without even shooting an arrow. Oh, we jumped and clapped with relief. We went to bed that night confident, but not yet knowing Yahweh's plan. Overnight, the angel of the Lord went out and killed 185,000 men in the camp of the Assyrians. When we woke up in the morning, there they were, all dead. King Sennacherib returned home to Nineveh, and the Assyrians never came up against Jerusalem again. Well, that was the first miracle. Later, during Hezekiah's reign, he had become very ill and his health was failing. Isaiah informed him to set his house in order, that he was going to die. After Isaiah departed the room, Hezekiah turned to the wall, cried out to the Lord in prayer, and wept bitterly. And guess what? Isaiah returned with the news that God had heard his prayer and decided to extend his life 15 more years. He also told Hezekiah that the Assyrians would never take Jerusalem. If that was not wondrous enough, God gave a heavenly sign to validate the healing. The shadow on the sundial went 10 degrees backward. Everyone knew Yahweh was up to something, and in 3 days, Hezekiah was healed and worshiping in the temple. Of course, Hezekiah's fame went far and wide with the news of these 3 miracles of Yahweh. Over time, he gained great riches and honor. He had treasuries of silver and gold. He rebuilt the fortified cities. About this time, envoys from Babylon, a rising empire, sent a letter to King Hezekiah. They wanted to visit him and bring a gift because they had heard the news that he had been on his deathbed and then recovered. But this new letter, he did not lay out before the Lord in the temple. He was not careful. Hezekiah's heart had become prideful. He carelessly welcomed the Babylonian envoys, showing them all the wealth in his kingdom. Unknowingly, this was a test given to him by Yahweh, and unfortunately, he did not pass it. Sadly, Isaiah brought Hezekiah a message again. One day, everything he had shown to the Babylonians would be carried off to Babylon, including his future generations of grandsons. Eventually, Hezekiah died, and his son Manasseh became king. He was, without a doubt, the most wicked king Judah ever had, even more wicked than his grandfather Ahaz. I regret to tell you that Manasseh hated Isaiah so much that he sentenced him to a gruesome death. He sawed him in two. Well, how the people who remained faithful to Yahweh grieved his death. But we had the prize, the scrolls of Isaiah, to comfort us. And what a comfort they were. From chapter 40 to the end of his great work, we were treated to the most amazing prophetic writing of all, the Holy of Holies of the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 53, prophecies of the coming Messiah, a suffering servant. In other places, he also shared with us words of a coming Messiah king and the millennial kingdom of Christ. So many beautiful passages of Scripture are found in his scrolls. Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. The Gentiles will come to your light. I decided during these days to memorize his words, saying them over and over in my mind as I went about my days. Each promise, each word was a special love letter from the Lord himself. I dreamed about the day I would meet our Messiah, a suffering servant and a reigning king. Spending eternity with Messiah became our blessed hope.